Dr. Anil, FICCI members, Excellencies, dear friends. First of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be with you on such an important occasion. And that too, as you are concluding your deliberations, I'm sure the last few days have been very productive, and my endeavor today would be to try and fit such thoughts as you may have into the state of the world and what we, all of us, could do to take India forward. So the topic I had requested Mr. Panda was to allow me to speak on going towards FICCI Bharat. Now we are, all of us, today meeting at a very important juncture. An important juncture because we have entered the Amrit Kal. We are also at the end of a decade of the Modi government. We have made big decisions, but clearly we are poised to make many more. We have nursed big ambitions. We have implemented much of what we had promised, but again, there are still a lot that we have to achieve. So to me, FICCI Bharat, it is both a vision to achieve as well as a set of specific goals, and the short description of it would be really how to make India a developed country in the next 25 years. Let me start with the domestic side. I think all of you would agree that while much has happened, much good has happened, the fact is also that the last decade has been quite tough. It was tough because we began it a decade ago with a lot of economic cleanup that was necessary, especially on the banking side. I think in many ways, faith in governance, faith in the business climate, faith in a desire to invest, I think all of that was flagging a decade ago. Some of it was the slow pace of change. Some of it was also that in our own minds, we were still comparing the pre-reform period with the post-reform period, whereas we had actually done 20 years of reform, and our standards of comparison, our benchmarking should have been something else. Now, as we reached the midpoint of the last decade, we of course experienced a once-in-a-century happening, the COVID pandemic. Now, I don't think anybody would dispute that amongst all of us today in the room, it would be the most scarring memory that we will carry for the rest of our lives. But as someone who traveled even during COVID and has traveled after COVID and has seen how other societies dealt with it, I can say with a lot of pride and with a lot of justification that India actually came out of COVID strong, that we were able to respond to it, and we were able to respond to it in an amazing way, because I remember as part of the group of ministers, we were 5, 6 of us who were tasked with dealing with COVID, and the first few weeks and months, I can't even describe to you the feeling when you realize that you actually do not have that ability to deal with what is coming. Since, as COVID receded, in fact, it wasn't just the bounce back, the social, the psychological bounce back that we saw. We also saw actually a very fast return to very robust economic growth. And the transformation which began a decade ago, that transformation once again picked up steam. I'll talk about it. And we have seen really today, the last quarter, I think the growth figures speak for themselves. But that's not the only index to judge how we are doing. And I would say with all objectivity that today when we look around the world, no question that, and again, I've just today come back from a destination abroad, no question that the world looks at us as an exceptionally strong area of growth. Now, while we've had both our domestic achievements and our domestic challenges and overcoming those domestic challenges, let's take a look at the state of the world. The last 5 years have also been very traumatic for the world. If you look in terms of 5 big shocks which have happened to the world, the COVID shock, which was not a shock, it was actually a long stress period. Then what happened in Afghanistan with the withdrawal of the Americans, the impact of the Ukraine conflict, what it did to fuel, to food, to fertilizer prices, to inflation across the world. Now, the violence that we are seeing in the Middle East, whose future directions are anybody's guess, and the consequences of very sharp competition between the United States and China, and the implications that has for global supply chains. I think you can see very clearly this has been actually a very stressful period for the international economy. Now, politically, when we look at the world, the talk is increasingly of a multipolar world, that people know. I mean, you don't have to be a political scientist or a diplomat today to understand that this is not a world of one power or two powers, that there are many more countries today in the fray. And that in many ways, I mean, while very welcome, also makes the world a more difficult place to navigate and to manage. At the same time, if one looks at the economic challenges of the world, today we are really looking at the consequences of what happens when trading rules are gamed, when competition has been unfair, and when actually the insecurities of the COVID era have caused many geographies, many regions, many big economies today to talk in terms of strategic autonomy, that, in China they call it dual circulation, in America they call it foreign policy for the middle class, in Europe they call it strategic autonomy, but the fact is today the world is heading towards greater insecurity and more protectionism. And the nature of how trading rules have been implemented over the last 2 to 3 decades actually have raised a lot of question marks about its effectiveness and the credibility of the regime. So this, in a sense, is the scenario that we confront. And as the Minister of External Affairs, and obviously a large part of my attention, the economic side of my attention, is very much on how we deal with the world economically, how we support our businesses, how we support our consumers, how we increase our employment. I think as a government, there's one thing on which we are very clear. And we are clear on this, that while opening up to the world may be good, because nobody disputes the realization of globalization, the reality of globalization, excuse me. Nobody disputes the reality of globalization. We all accept that opening up to the world is good. But opening up to the world must happen only when there is a level playing field for our own industry at home. It cannot be at the cost of our industry. And I think that is one message which the Modi government has sent in a sustained manner over the last decade. So with that context, if I can be a little presumptuous, allow me to talk about your role and responsibilities. Business today is something very much bigger than just business. All of you who are sitting here, in many ways, are actually leaders of modernity and progress. Because when you build the economy, when you build industry, as you expand services, as you propagate and spread technology, it's actually the ideas, the concepts, the projects that you do, the mindsets that you have created as a result. I think that in many ways, is actually the engine for India's progress. You are also builders of national strength. And I think that is a larger responsibility that must always be in your mind. One of our concerns in the post-reform period has been that while we have concentrated a lot on growth, and understandably so, and I completely understand that at the end of the day, businesses have to look at their bottom lines. The fact is, it's in our collective interest, I would argue in your interest, that we build deep strengths at home, the way in which many other economies which all of you admire, have done at their homes. So I'm not in any way diminishing the importance of international trade, and I'm not oblivious to the global supply chain. But I think it's important, especially for big business in India, to help build Indian supply chains, to support Indian vendors. Because at the end of the day, no country will be strong if it doesn't have its own supply chain, if it doesn't have its basic requirements. Certainly a large economy, a big nation like India, a nation with the kind of ambitions and future that we have, it is very, very important that we are Atmanirbhar. So I would therefore urge you, as you go about it, as you look at really growing your own businesses, to also see what you can do really to help others in the business chain who in the medium and long term will actually be to your benefit if they are part of our society. The third, of course, is that you are all creators of employment. That employment will not grow in this country if business doesn't grow. I think it's a no-brainer, but it is not always something which is so clearly recognized. That if we wish to grow employment, it is important that we give the support to the creators of employment, only then employment will grow. In many ways, you are also the shapers of our image. You are shapers of our image, not just in a sort of broad branding way. I think business is a reference point for the rest of the world. Anybody who's coming into India wanting to invest will more likely go by what you say than go by what I say. Because at the end of the day, business will listen to business. And the same works outside. That if somebody outside actually has an image of India, wants to judge the prospects of India, wants to evaluate really how we are doing, where we are likely to be, I think the natural avenue for them to explore that is actually with the business community in India. So for me, whether it is modernity and progress, whether it is building national strength, whether it is creating employment, whether it is shaping our image, and whether, as a driver of development. Because at the end of the day, any project, any business, anything you do, the ripple consequences of that are enormous. Every employee has a family. Every increase in prosperity has some larger consequence not just for the lives of those people, larger consequences actually for the entire society. So in many ways, if we are today really to increase, to deepen development, intensify development, make it much more inclusive, it isn't just the need for more resources. That is obviously very, very critical. But the role that business plays, especially the role that business can play in, for example, aspirational districts, in parts of India which, for whatever reason, perhaps had got left behind, I think is tremendous. And so there is actually a social agent aspect to your activities as well. So if I were to sum it all up today, when nations assess each other, they don't do so anymore just in terms, a strong country is not necessarily a militarily strong country. It need not be even just an economically strong country. There is a concept of comprehensive national power. You put everything together. And it is that net assessment of how a nation or a society is, which is actually the value and the weight of that society in international relations. And a big part of that weightage is actually directly derived from your activities. So when we look at India's prospect, one part of it is what are we going to be doing with our own lives? We want to move towards a developed society. But if I were to look at India in the world, a large part of how the world would regard India is very much dependent on actually how business is doing in India. Now, as I pointed out, Viksit Bharat is clearly the goal for Amrit Kal, and we very much hope that this decade has actually laid a very strong foundation for that to happen. So let me rewind a bit and actually see what has changed in the last decade. Why is it that we even have the confidence to talk about becoming a developed nation? I would put it in about 4 or 5 broad baskets. One is that through this decade, in many, many ways, we have made it easier to do business. It will never be a done deal. It'll always be work in progress. We can never sit back on whatever achievements there are. But the fact is, if you look back over the last 5 years, then look back over the previous 5 years, and then perhaps the previous 5 or 10, there's no question today that there's been a very marked improvement in the climate for business, in making it easier to do business in this country. The second, which is actually a broader endeavor, is something which the Modi government calls ease of living. Ease of living is actually how do we, I would say, de-bureaucratize this society, that in the many things that we want in our daily lives, many things which all of you need to actually do more business in this country, to invest more easily, to produce more easily, to sell more easily. How do we make the life of the average citizen easier, less burdened, less regulated in a cumbersome way? And of course, the example which I am most familiar with and which all of you have experienced is the ease with which today you get passports. So if you look back at what a passport meant 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I don't think you even want to remember. So my point is, if you look at what the government is doing to cut red tape, to simplify regulations, to make public services more entitlement driven, that government does services not because it's doing a favor to its citizens. It is doing services because that is the entitlement of the citizen from the government. And in many ways, that kind of belief is today trying to transform the manner in which the government responds to the expectations of the people. The third one, and I saw that briefly referred to in that clip before my talk, is actually what has long been the bane of our economy, and that's the infrastructure. So the impact which Gati Shakti is making, the whole idea, because one of our problems is we are actually, even by global standards, we are an extraordinarily siloed society, a siloed bureaucracy, that it isn't just the left hand and the right hand, one finger or one hand doesn't know what the other finger is doing. So what we would have is, whether it is the railway, the power, the road, the water, the optical fiber, the airport, each one was done as an autonomous, sometimes even independent activity, sometimes as a result working at cross purposes and actually not using resources optimally. So the idea actually of bringing it all together, of having a kind of a master plan, not just a master plan, a coordinated effort to do that, that to my mind is actually an endeavor which has done well in the last few years, and as that gains more traction, I think we're going to see the results of that. A fourth basket I would put to you is the digital basket. The digital basket, because this term, digital public infrastructure, if in this year there are a few terms which have, I would say, come into vogue in my business, one is the voice of the global south and one of them is digital public infrastructure. The idea that governments use digital backbones really to even with limited resources, cover a very large part of the population by doing it with all the efficiency which digital instruments can offer. And if we look back, I mean, all of you are familiar with the campaigns, the initiatives, the yojanas of the last decade, okay? You can reel them out one by one, you know, Awas Yojana, Garib Kalyan Yojana, Anna Yojana, Mudra, Jal Jeevan Mission, Swachh Bharat, Skill India, Digital India. There is a range of this. Now, what is the common element? What is the foundation? Why is it today that the government, because if you look at these campaigns, just the volume, you know, the number of people covered in these campaigns. Individual campaigns have beneficiaries which run not just into the population of large countries, they are actually sometimes continents. That today, the Anna Yojana, we give 5 kilograms of food to 800 million people every month. That's the population of 2 decent-sized continents. That under Mudra, you actually give, you pay money into, again, about 400 million beneficiaries. That if one looks at, you know, even something like Awas Yojana, building houses, which is quite complicated. In the last 10 years, in urban and rural areas, we built 40 million houses, which at 4.8% average per family is almost 200 million, it's 190 million people. 190 million people is like housing 1.5 times the size of Japan in the course of a decade. So look at the scale of what we are doing today. That scale. And we saw that more sharply demonstrated during COVID. You know, and because it happened so quickly and so efficiently, to all of you, it was very natural. I don't mean it in a bad way, but you all took it for granted. If you had gone around the world, you would have seen countries who are sitting on mounds of vaccine, who are not able to vaccinate people, their own population. If they vaccinated them, they didn't know how to certify it. If they certified it, they didn't know how to call them back for the second shot or the third shot. So this extraordinary change which has happened today in our country, this is riding on the digitization of India. That the manner in which today we have been able to vastly expand public services. You know, we can actually, if I had said a decade ago that there's a serious problem, because, you know, one of the preconditions to being even looked at as Viksit is you should have some kind of social welfare system. I mean, you know, what happens in a developed society?